Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Religion and the Law Forum, a public conversation at the intersection of faith, society, ethics, and the law. We apologize for the technical difficulties that we had at the beginning, and we've lost already 15 precious minutes. We will have a 90-minute conversation together with our distinguished panelists. I hope all of you will stay and interact with us through Q&A as we discuss the important questions regarding vaccines and the faithful, religious liberty, and the common good. This is a collaboration between Loma University School of Religion, Andrews University International Religious Liberty Institute, and the Church State Council of the Pacific Union Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. My name is Julius Nam. I'm a co-chair of the Religion and the Law Forum at Loma University, and I'm joined here by my co-chair, Professor Zane Yi. Dr. Yi is Associate Dean of the School of Religion at Loma Linda University. He's also an Associate Professor of Philosophy and Theology, and Zane and I will be co-moderating this discussion. Zane?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Religion and Law Forum. I'm going to invite you to bow your heads in prayer as we begin. God, we come to you upon a year, and for some of us more, of difficult challenges as a global community. We acknowledge your presence with us throughout it all and are grateful for the progress that is being made in some parts of our society. We pray for those who have experienced loss and continue to struggle. Comfort them. And we ask for your wisdom this afternoon as we seek to understand how to be responsible citizens and to reflect your love to our world, to bring about hope and healing. In your name we pray. Amen. Well, let's just dive right into the conversation. Jennifer, we're going to turn to you. You're at the GC as an attorney, able to address some of these issues from that standpoint. But before that, you had a former life in working in healthcare law for various institutions in the government sector as well as private. You have an MPH in public health. So we're really glad you're here. And we want to invite you to offer some opening comments on the current state of vaccination requirements and exemptions in different jurisdictions and their public health concerns and rationales.
Sure, thank you, Zane and Julius. So I'm going to spend a few minutes to briefly discuss the status of vaccination requirements and exemptions along with public health rationales for them. So vaccines have been around since the late 1700s when Edward Jenner first discovered a vaccine for smallpox. Before the smallpox vaccine was developed, it was one of the deadliest diseases that was known to humans. The smallpox vaccine, introduced by Jenner in 1796, was the first successful vaccine to be developed. He observed that milkmaids who previously had contracted cowpox did not catch smallpox. And based on this knowledge, he created and administered the first smallpox vaccinations using materials from cowpox lesions. Since that time, vaccines have been developed to combat a variety of diseases that at one time caused countless deaths. Diseases like tetanus, rubella, measles, mumps, and pertussis, while not eradicated, no longer cause the havoc in the United States that they once did. Not long after vaccines were developed, vaccination mandates began, with the first in the United States occurring in the 1850s during a smallpox epidemic in Massachusetts. Now every state has vaccination mandates in place. The goal of vaccination is both individual immunity and herd immunity. By having enough of the population protected from a disease, herd immunity is reached. Herd immunity occurs when enough individuals become immune to a disease to make its spread unlikely. As a result, the entire community becomes protected, even individuals who are not themselves immune. Herd immunity is usually achieved through vaccination. Depending on the disease, different percentages of the population need to be vaccinated in order to achieve herd immunity. For example, herd immunity against measles, which is highly contagious, requires about 95% of the population to be vaccinated. The remaining 5% will be protected by the fact that measles will not spread among those who are vaccinated. In comparison, for a disease like polio, the threshold was about 80%. Because such high percentages of the population need to be vaccinated in order to achieve herd immunity, the government has an interest in making sure that those percentages are reached to protect the community at large. Currently, vaccination programs are managed at the state level based on recommendations from the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which Dr. Hogue can speak more to. Additionally, vaccines are subject to licensure in the US by the Food and Drug Administration, which follows studies that address safety and efficacy of various vaccines. Many states align their vaccine requirements with recommendations from the ACIP. By and large, our immunization schedule begins as children, and parents have to show proof of vaccination to enroll their kids in school. In the US, infants and young children are currently vaccinated against 11 diseases, including diphtheria, measles, mumps, pertussis, rubella, and tetanus. Most of these diseases, except for tetanus, have a very high incidence in school-age children because of the high potential of transmission in the congregate setting. All 50 states have laws mandating vaccinations for students to go to school, and all states provide exemptions to the vaccination requirement. All states grant medical exemptions because there are some individuals who, for health reasons, can't be vaccinated. One of the aims of reaching herd immunity is to keep these vulnerable groups who can't get vaccinated due to the risks involved, such as health conditions like allergic reactions to the vaccine or having a compromised immune system, to keep these individuals safe and protected from the disease. In addition to medical exemptions, 45 states also allow exemptions based on religious beliefs, and 15 states grant philosophical exemptions. One of the reasons that non-medical exemptions were introduced was to try to respond to and prevent vaccine-related backlash. There's a strong culture, especially in the United States, of personal autonomy. People don't want the government to force them to do something or to tell them what to put into their body. People want to be able to make decisions about the risks that they're willing to take with certain vaccinations. And by allowing these non-medical exemptions, it's a way to allow people to feel like they have some sort of choice in the matter. Usually the number of people who rely on exemptions, both medical and non-medical, have been extremely small. But the issue arises when the number of individuals wanting an exemption rises to a level that the required percentages of vaccinations needed to be reached in order to provide herd immunity isn't met. When this occurs, we have seen outbreaks of vaccine preventable diseases in communities with lower vaccine coverage. One example, a recent example, dealt with the outbreak of measles in California because the numbers of individuals getting the vaccination fell beneath the threshold for herd immunity. As I stated earlier, roughly 90% of the community need to be vaccinated to reach herd immunity for measles because it is highly contagious. In California, vaccinations for measles in 2013 was a little bit over 92%. So the following year, in 2014, someone with measles visited Disneyland over the holidays, and they sparked an outbreak that rapidly grew across the state. This outbreak ultimately infected 131 Californians and was fueled by low vaccination rates. Within months, California tightened the state's vaccination laws. They prevented parents from opting out of vaccinations for anything other than medical reasons. And since that time, vaccination rates in California have risen and communities are again protected through herd immunity. Currently, there are 5 states, Mississippi, California, West Virginia, Maine, and New York, that don't grant any non-medical exemptions. And California, Maine, and New York recently restricted their vaccination laws to take away these non-medical exemptions. But this illustrates a tension that's been present ever since mandatory vaccines were introduced between individual liberty and protecting the public's health through state police powers. With that, I'll turn it over to the next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. As Zane mentioned, Jennifer is attorney for the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, who holds a dual role of being an attorney for the church, but also as a public health advocate. Our next panelist that I'll be introducing, Nick Miller, also holds a dual role, if you will. He's an attorney trained at Columbia Law School, but he's also a church historian trained at Notre Dame. And he heads the International Religious Liberty Institute at Andrews University. Nick, if you could add to what Jennifer just shared with us in terms of the legal framework for vaccination mandates or requirement, kind of going back in history. I understand there's a Supreme Court decision going back to the 1905 Jacobson decision, which I'm sure you'll be talking about, that has provided a framework of thinking about the state's interest in maintaining public health, and also what the individuals who may have objections, what their rights are. So if you could kind of give us an introductory framework into the constitutional legal history of this issue.
Sure, I'm happy to, Julius. So as Jennifer said, vaccines were developed throughout the 19th century. And in Europe, they began to be mandated in various jurisdictions, and some American states followed in their footsteps. And this issue worked its way to the Supreme Court in 1905, dealing with the smallpox vaccine out of Massachusetts. A pastor that had been born in Sweden by the name of Jacobson did not want to take the vaccine. Apparently, he had a history as a child of being vaccinated in Europe and had not responded to it well. There's no record that I can find in the decision that he was making a religious liberty claim. At that point, the First Amendment had not been applied to the states. The 14th Amendment did, however, and he felt this was an invasion of his basic rights of due process. And he made the argument to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was not impressed, said that basically communities had a right to protect themselves and the health of their citizens from these diseases, and that vaccines had been shown and were generally accepted by the medical community as providing this sort of protection. They ruled that the state was within its rights to mandate the vaccine, but 2 points should be noted: that they didn't actually require him to be vaccinated. They just upheld the penalty, which was a $5 fine, probably worth about $100, $150 now. And secondly, in the decision, they did say that if there was some medical, physical reason that he should not take it, there was some physical fragility, that certainly the courts would carve out an exemption. This ruling is still good law and has been cited by courts more recently. The only other time the Supreme Court has dealt with the vaccine question was just about 17 years later in the case Zucht versus King. And there the Supreme Court upheld a city ordinance that prohibited anyone from attending a public or a private school without a certificate of smallpox vaccination. So that wasn't a direct mandate for all citizens, but it was a school attendance. If you wanted to attend school, you had to have this proof of vaccination. So these are the two cases that kind of guide us as we consider this question in the 21st century. But I would have to say that while Jacobson is technically still good law, there's been a lot that's developed in both medical law and civil liberties law since then. So especially after World War II, we became much more sensitive to questions of informed consent, right? The horrors of the experimentations by various countries during the war on minorities and Jews has led the medical community and the legal community to embrace the pillar of informed consent, meaning that medical procedures will not be carried out on adults, rational adults, in the absence of their consent. There's also been a further development of civil liberties and First Amendment rights, so that there's a more robust law of individual rights and liberties. And I would say that in the light of these developments, that it is very unlikely that the Supreme Court or any court would uphold the forcible vaccination of any, at least adult, against their will, absent extraordinary circumstances. But much more likely is the Zucht precedent of making certain access to public facilities like education, schools, colleges, and perhaps even moving out into public traveling situations, buses, airplanes, certainly holding jobs, public health jobs, and other jobs where you frequently come into contact with the public. It seems to me that the Supreme Court precedent would allow both states and employers to set down conditions of access to public facilities and places where you will be exposed to the public. So that's the basic legal framework we're facing, and what the limits are and what the government probably can, the sorts of conditions that they can create.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you, Jennifer, for providing some of the legal history and framework. We're going to turn to our third distinguished panelist, Dr. Michael Hogue. Michael, you are on the front lines of this issue from the clinical perspective, as well as the policy and government perspective. Before you, you joined the Loma Linda faculty as the Dean of the School of Pharmacy, but if I understand correctly, you were appointed to serve on the CDC's advisory committee on immunization practices dealing specifically with COVID-19. I also know that you are heading the community vaccination effort here at Loma University, where we have a gym and the county residents of San Bernardino County are coming to get vaccination. So we're really glad you're here, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on the pandemic, the current efficacy and safety of the COVID-19 vaccines that have been developed, and the distribution of these vaccines, as well as the issue that Jennifer drew our attention to, which is the importance of reaching herd immunity. So Michael, we turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Zane. And there's an awful lot I could say about the COVID vaccines and the science and so forth. I'll try to distill down just a few key items. A couple of the things I'll tee up, I think that'll help with our conversation a little bit later on as we go into ethics as well. A lot of people have been curious about these COVID vaccines for a lot of us seeing the vaccines come to market in such a quick period of time. I realize it's been concerning to some about how fast vaccines came to market and how is it possible scientifically for that to occur. So let's back up just a moment and say that when the coronavirus was first identified, scientists were able to actually do genetic sequencing of the entire genetic code of the coronavirus, the DNA sequencing of this virus. And we're able to identify this thing pretty quickly. I think the first cases occurred in late 2019, and by mid-January of 2020, we knew the entire genetic sequence. Well, that was pretty amazing, because when you think about it, and this just shows how science evolves, and how God allows us to learn so much from our world around us. With that genetic sequence, scientists were able to quickly get to work using platforms or methods for vaccine creation that had previously been utilized and known before to create antigens that our bodies would hopefully create antibodies. The antibodies are the protective portions of our immune system that help fight off disease. And so in order for antibodies to be produced, our body has to be exposed to an antigen, has to be able to see it and recognize it as foreign, and then produce antibodies. Now, of course, every time you're exposed to something infectious, something that's not supposed to be in your body produces antibodies. So, for example, all of us have had a common cold a time or two in our life. The rhinoviruses that oftentimes cause the common cold, when your body's exposed to that, you actually do produce antibodies and you fight off certain strains of the common cold. But there's a lot of rhinoviruses, so you can get sick again. Well, so ideally, what we're doing with vaccines is we're trying to create something that fools our body or tricks our body into thinking that we've been exposed to the thing we want to prevent, in this case, coronavirus, and get our body to produce antibodies against that virus so that if we are exposed to the real virus, our bodies fight it off and we don't get sick. And so that's how antibodies work. And so that's what we do with the coronavirus. So there have been about 140 different vaccines under development globally, worldwide. That's a lot, 140 different vaccines. Some of the vaccines take a long time to produce, and some of the vaccine candidates and the way that they were used don't take long at all to produce. The first two vaccines that we've seen here in the United States are messenger RNA vaccines, mRNA vaccines. We haven't had vaccines on the market widely used in populations using this technology before, but the technology has been used to be able to elicit immune responses. The National Institutes of Health has used mRNA technology to treat certain types of cancer in targeted immune therapies in the past. And many years ago, some of you may remember the SARS virus and the SARS infection that occurred in Asia and in the Middle East. And there was an attempt at that time to create a vaccine. Thankfully, the virus was contained and we didn't have to do widespread immunization. And so that vaccine platform didn't move forward. But mRNA vaccines are very fast to produce. It doesn't take long in a laboratory to produce a messenger RNA vaccine. And that's an important thing to know because the technology that was used can be moved very fast along the continuum. Now, the Food and Drug Administration over the last 20 years has approved about 11 different vaccines for use in the population, new ones. And in that period of time, the average number of people who were enrolled in the clinical trials to bring a product, a vaccine to market, was about 24,000, an average of 24,000 people per clinical trial. The Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, which have come to market first in the United States, and then just as of yesterday, the Janssen J&J vaccine that's now been approved or is likely to receive the FDA commissioner's nod tomorrow or today, each of those studies had 40,000 people in the study. So these studies actually enrolled more people than the average study has enrolled that we've had vaccines brought to market with up to this point. So that's a good thing. How were we able to scientifically move this along the process? Well, normally there's a 3-phase stage to approving products, vaccines to market. Phase 1 is we determine what the dose needs to be, and we determine the basic safety profile of the vaccine. Once that's done, then we move into phase 2, where we do dose ranging studies, where we test different dosages in different populations. And then phase 3 is when we take the selected dose and test it in very large populations against either a standard vaccine or a placebo. And this time it was a placebo that was tested against because we had no coronavirus vaccines on the market. So we sped things up this time in terms of science by combining phase 2 and phase 3 and having those occur at the same time. That allowed more rapid data to be collected. Now, the studies for these vaccines are still ongoing, believe it or not. Yes, we have these vaccines on the market, but they're approved under what's called an emergency use authorization, which is something that was authorized by the U.S. Congress in the event that we had a breakthrough therapy or a breakthrough vaccine that could stop the pandemic. The FDA had the authority to issue emergency use authorization, and that's what they've done. But the studies are actually still going on, and we're still getting data from them. In fact, I see data pretty regularly from these studies at the CDC, and we're progressing on with safety data and with the efficacy data. The Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, both were shown to have a 95% efficacy in the early trials. And then subsequently in the follow-up, we have verified and validated that in fact, these two vaccines prevent 95% of all cases of coronavirus. And that's incredible. That is very, very excellent efficacy in looking at vaccines. Just as an example, the flu vaccine, when it's an excellent match to the circulating flu, might reach 60% efficacy in the best year possible. In most years, it's about 40% efficacy. So to have something that's 95% effective at preventing disease, that's incredible. That's really remarkable. The Janssen J&J vaccine has an overall efficacy of about 70% at preventing primary infection, but important, and probably most important, is it's 88% effective at preventing serious disease that leads to hospitalization or death. What that means is that the Janssen vaccine is just as effective as the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine at preventing someone from being hospitalized or dying from coronavirus. The benefit of the Janssen vaccine, of course, is it's 1 dose instead of 2. So these are the foundations on which these vaccines were brought to market. Zane, we could talk a long time about the science behind the vaccines, but I want to just throw these out here. Now, getting back to something I think Jennifer and Nick talked about a little bit were vaccine mandates, and I know you're going to get into this just a little bit later. The fact that these are approved under an emergency use authorization also raises some things we have to think about in terms of mandates, because the vaccines are not fully approved and the studies are not fully done. So, you know, the CDC's approach up to this point has been that they do not believe that mandates are appropriate at this time until the studies are finished. And they've stated that, and I believe FDA has stated the same. So I think that that's the basic position, and I'd be very interested a little bit later as we get into that part of the program to hear Jennifer and Nick's take on that piece of it. So Julius or Zane, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Michael. I want to stay with you for a few more minutes. So based on the past year's experience during this pandemic, from the perspective of science as it relates to public health, what are some of the key lessons that we've learned as a society, and what are the key questions that remain?
Well, from a scientific standpoint, one thing we learned, and we learned this actually from our brothers and sisters in Australia first, is that you can control the spread of respiratory illnesses very quickly by controlling the spread of respiratory secretions. So the most contagious respiratory virus that we have in currently that we see circulate is one that Jennifer mentioned earlier. It's measles virus. Measles virus can live for 2 hours in the air, just floating in the air, and it's highly contagious and infectious. Coronavirus has different characteristics, but we've learned that masking when someone is sick, in particular, when someone has symptoms of an upper respiratory infection, masking is a very effective way at stopping the spread of illness. And most of us who are American, this was a very uncomfortable, it's been very uncomfortable and an unnatural thing to do, to mask. But I have served on mission in Asia for a lot of years on short-term mission assignments in Asia. And it's very customary in many Asian cultures that if you have a sniffle or a runny nose or a cough, you wear a mask, and you do that all the time. It's been that way for as long as I can remember, in making trips to various parts of Asia, as generally accepted. Why? Because we know that when we're sick, we don't want to spread that illness to someone else, and masking prevents it. So one of the scientific things we've learned is that masking does help stop the spread of viruses. And because we've been so good at masking here, especially in Southern California, not only is coronavirus rates falling, but we've had very little influenza this year, almost no influenza, because it's also respiratory spread. And the number of actually the common cold has been on the decline also. There's been fewer cases of just the common cold, upper respiratory. So that's one thing. The second thing that we've learned is that vaccines work. The RAND Corporation has just released some data about how we prevent the spread of disease. And our strategy in the US was to first immunize frontline healthcare workers, okay? And that's great. We did that. And in fact, I don't have the data, specific data to share with you, but Dr. April Wilson and the folks in employee health and student health at Loma Linda saw a tremendous decline in the number of cases of coronavirus among healthcare workers after we did our mass vaccination campaign of healthcare workers at Loma Linda. There was this wonderful decline. Yesterday, or I guess it was earlier this week, in the New York Times, there was a beautiful graph that showed the number of cases of COVID and the number of deaths from COVID in nursing homes in the USA has dropped dramatically at a rate that outpaces the general drop that's occurred in society. Why is that? Because nursing homes were tiered early to receive the vaccine. And we've seen a direct result of that is that now there are fewer and fewer deaths occurring in nursing home residents. That's good. Now is where it gets tricky from a US policy standpoint. How do we determine scientifically? We know some things. One thing we know is that older people who are over 65, when we have quarantines, tend to obey those quarantines and follow them pretty closely. They stay home and they stay to themselves and they isolate. Younger people tend to not isolate. And also, younger people tend to be more of the frontline workforce. Okay, so the RAND Corporation has done some modeling and calculations based upon the infection rate, and they discovered that if we immunized only the elderly population, we would only stop the spread of the virus in the larger community by about 1%. There would only be about a 1% reduction in overall community spread of the virus. But if we immunize frontline workers against coronavirus, then we could actually reduce the spread of the virus by 95% in the community. And so, there's this argument about, well, older people are more likely to die from COVID, so we need to vaccinate older people. I agree with that. It's good logic. Okay. It's to care for those who are older. That's great. But we can't forget our frontline workers, because by immunizing these people who may otherwise be healthy, okay, we're stopping the spread of the virus. And a frontline worker who has asymptomatic coronavirus infection could potentially spread it to 10, 15, 20 people or more, many of those people who may have weakened immune systems or may not be able to fight off the infection and might die. And so from a strategic standpoint, this has really led to a lot of debate in our society. Who do you vaccinate next? And so, but the math tells us that we need to immunize people who are going to be likely to spread the virus to others. And so those are some of the scientific learnings, Julius, I think that I've observed in the last few months. There's many more.
Jennifer, would you like to respond to that from the public health perspective and maybe share a little bit about what we've learned thinking about this from a social level?
Yeah, I think that, from a public health level, what we want to do is, you want to mandate, you want to vaccinate diseases which are highly contagious. I think COVID falls under that to some degree, that pose significant morbidity or mortality, and where there's a threat to students, teachers, or the community or the elderly, right? As far as how that is best achieved, I think, again, the goal is to reach herd immunity. You want to slow the spread of the disease. And so, as Michael said, it might seem logical to vaccinate older individuals, but if vaccinating younger frontline workers actually slows the spread of the disease, then that's what is in the public's interest for public health reasons.
And Jennifer, from your perspective, from what Michael has shared, do you feel like the vaccines when you zoom way back, is making an impact on helping us reach that point of herd immunity?
I mean, we're still in the very early stages, but yeah, I mean, I think that, again, herd immunity is reached most easily through vaccination. And so this is getting us in the right direction. We're going to need way more people, way more individuals to get the vaccine to get to that point. But we are on that projection, I think.
Could I just add that that's one of the big debates right now is the allocation and distribution of vaccine, because you know, the two vaccines that we have had up in the market until this point require 2 doses. They have very specific storage requirements. They're fragile vaccines that have to be handled appropriately, stored appropriately. And a lot of communities of color and rural communities don't have necessarily the access to these vaccines, which is unfortunate. Those are the communities that really need to be getting this vaccine and receiving it, but the distribution system is not there. And that's really created a big problem. So there's a lot of hope as of yesterday with this new vaccine that's been approved, which doesn't require the frozen shipping temperatures, requires a single dose to be able to provide protection, that maybe now, if production quantities are up high enough, we'll actually be able to get enough vaccine into all communities that there won't be a difference between what we see from one community to another. And we really do have to get this distribution thing right. There's 100 ways to do it wrong. There really are. And we sometimes are very good at getting things wrong. So we've got to get this right, because we can't afford to let this pandemic just wage on.
What Michael is pointing out has to do with what is the right way and also what is the fair way of dealing with the pandemic, and that gets to the question of legal issues. And it's I want to loop Nick into this conversation. There's been some litigation. In our last webinar, we talked about religious groups litigating the question of restricting orders by states as to gathering, and there's been a very interesting and challenging balancing of interests at play here. If you could just sort of summarize for us some of the lessons and challenges and questions that have arisen in the past year.
Yeah, sure. And in fact, I think that these challenges are only going to grow weightier. You know, I'm a historian, but it doesn't. You don't need to be a prophet to see that we are headed towards an inexorable clash of values. We talk about herd immunity, and we haven't given a precise figure here. Jennifer mentioned 90% for measles. I've heard Dr. Fauci talk about 70, 80, 85%. We've had 10% of Americans become infected. That's caused 500,000 deaths, right? We've had about 10% receive the first injection. We have to get to 80%. If we get there, if we get to herd immunity naturally, that means we're going to have to kill 500,000 for every 10% more, or something like that, right? 10% has resulted in 500,000 deaths. So we're talking about several million deaths. Or we get there through vaccination, but the statistics seem to show that about half the people in America are willing to be vaccinated. Well, that only gets us to 50%. We've got to get to 70 or 80%. So right now, it's not mandatory. But I don't think you need to be a prophet to say, well, we're going to come to a point where we have 50% immunity and we got to get to 70 or 80%. What is going to give? And I think that some of the things that are going to have to give, you know, it's a little scary looking at the statistics. America is consistently in the top 5 or 10 worst countries of deaths per capita. You know, and we have the most money and the most resources put towards healthcare, and yet we're having these high death levels. And I'm sure there's a complex set of variables related to it, but from a historian and a lawyer, I think something that's helping drive it is what I would call hyper-American individualism. And I have a high regard for the importance of the individual. My dissertation was on Martin Luther's Priesthood of Believers. and the importance that gave to the individual after the Middle Age suppression of the individual, and how it brought about, reformations not only in religion, but in society and science and business. It helped build up our country. But I think historians would acknowledge that beginning at the end of the 19th or beginning of the 20th century, a kind of progressivism that made the individual, the autonomous individual, the most important thing in society, turned the priesthood of believers. Because if you think about that phrase, it's a communitarian phrase. It's a priesthood of believers. We took it from a pope and a few priests to making everybody part of the decision-making process. But this progressive autonomous self has created not a priesthood of all believers, but like a collection of popes, right? Everyone is his own full and final authority in matters of religion and belief and science. And we've become wedded to our anti-intellectual ways. We're not going to believe the experts. We're going to believe, our own intuitions and our own selves. And I think that there's a tremendous lesson here about the importance of community relationships, of learning. I call this the epistemology of relationships, right? I don't know about these testing these vaccines. I haven't observed it firsthand, but Dr. Hogue has been overseeing, part of the group that's overseeing this. And I have no reason not to have confidence in my fellow Christian brothers' experience and knowledge in this area. Surely he's not out for my harm. I see 500,000 dead people, and he's telling me that there's a high level of efficacy here. And, Christ, to come back to the spiritual sense, and maybe I'm moving from the legal to the spiritual, but, Christ to doubting Thomas, who says, I'm going to believe when I see. Well, Christ says, blessed are they that haven't seen and yet believe. Blessed are they that are willing to take the testimony of their brothers and sisters, not anybody and everybody, but their brothers and sisters that they should have confidence in because of training, because of character, because of experience, and that we can be blessed by that. And as Adventists, we're going to have to learn to set aside at times our almost perseveration, unlike don't tread on me, individual rights, conscience is everything, right? The Sunday laws are coming and stay off me. Well, the New Testament also talks about governments being organized for our good, to protect us against evil and to promote the good. And when they're doing that, these vaccines, and we'll talk a little bit more later about the basis of religious objections, but I do think that the legal lesson is we have to take a breath and a step back from the hyper-American individualism and recognize there are valid communitarian interests about loving our brothers and loving our neighbors that we need to make part of the equation.
And if I can just jump in there, I think that Nick mentioned a really important point, and that is that we're going to have to look at this as more than just our own self-interest. We have to look at the community good, at social welfare, because on an individual level, there may be more risks than benefits for me to get vaccinated, right? Because vaccinations do carry risks. But when I look at it from a community standpoint, I'm protecting those who might not be able to get vaccinated, and I'm contributing toward herd immunity. And so we have to take a broader look than just what's in my best interest.
I want to stay with you, Jennifer, and ask, since you are one of the attorneys for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and many in the audience are coming from that particular community, if you could kind of share with us what the church's perspective and recommendation guidance has been, and perhaps widen that also to kind of get to the biblical principles that undergird that guidance.
Sure. So the church has had an immunization statement that precedes COVID-19. And it's pretty straightforward. It says that, we place strong emphasis on biblical revelation, on the writings of Ellen G. White, on peer-reviewed scientific literature. And it says, as such, we encourage responsible immunization, vaccination, and have no religious or faith-based reason not to encourage our adherents to responsibly participate in protective and preventative immunization programs. The church goes on to say, we value the health and safety of the population, which includes the maintenance of herd immunity. So, I think that it takes the perspective that Nick talked about, that we have to look beyond ourselves. We look at the interests of our community as a whole in protecting the health of those who may be vulnerable.
Zane, you are a co-moderator with me, but you are a esteemed philosopher and ethicist and a theologian. So I want to just ask your take as to what biblical principles and what principles can we look to in Scripture to help us think about vaccination and our individual ethical, moral decisions connected with that.
And I think our panelists have brought the issue kind of to the fore, and all these issues, whether it be masking or gatherings or vaccination, there's like these competing interests that we're being asked to reason about and decide upon. The individual's reservations, relative safety concerns, some of those are legitimate concerns, being weighed against what's good for the public, what's good for the community. And I think the panelists have just done a really good job of directing us to, hey, it's not just individual rights and concerns that should be part of the calculus, right? But that we should be concerned about the greater good, that God cares for the whole of creation and calls upon humans as stewards of that creation to care for it, and society as a part of that, as well as their neighbors, right? And so I think this is a really important thing to consider. You can give arguments from both, I think, the theological scriptural point, which has been offered, but also just philosophically, that we should be concerned about the greatest good for the greatest number. And even if we don't land on like, oh, I'm going to be a consequentialist, that should be something we consider as we think about the relative weight of our individual decisions and choices.
Nick, I think you have a comment.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up. Jennifer's talked about the church, and I'm the Parle Director, Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director for the Lake Union. And the other Parle directors and I have talked about this because in the past, some unions have provided exemption letters for certain kinds of vaccines. And those, though, are usually ones where there's been some objections by some people. And I see this in the Q&A of where unclean animal materials will be in the vaccine as part of the matrix, a gel or something from pork. But these vaccines, the COVID-19 vaccine, as far as I know, and experts that I've conferred with, they do not have any of these materials in them. Neither do they have any fetal cell or fetal materials in them. So as a group, we felt that there was no biblical or church teaching basis for there to be an objection to this vaccine, and none of the unions that we've had discussions with are willing to write letters on behalf of our members. Now, of course, our members have their own consciences. They have the right to autonomy. They can raise objections individually, but we felt that it would be misleading for us to write a letter, and that would imply that there's some sort of church teaching that would oppose this vaccine. And we all agree, and I also teach at the seminary, and my seminary colleagues agree, that there is no church teaching that would oppose this vaccine. Rather, there are many teachings that would support our members going ahead and taking this vaccine.
Michael,
Julius, I have
go ahead, Zane.
No, I was going to direct my question to Michael. One of the issues that's come up is, I guess, the safety of the vaccines relatively. We've talked about their efficacy, but if there's a church member or a citizen that says, hey, I care about the greater good, but, are these safe? What are the side effects? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Let me summarize that, because we've gotten quite a few questions in the question box about vaccine safety and some specific issues, and I think I will just give some address to this. There are always risks associated with any intervention, whether it's a medicine you take or a vaccine. This vaccine has certain adverse events that we expect to happen, some things that we know when you get the vaccine, it's very likely they're going to happen. For example, This vaccine causes almost every single person who gets the vaccine to have a sore arm, pretty markedly the morning after they wake up from being vaccinated. And that sore arm may also have redness at the site of injection and tenderness and a headache. A headache is pretty common after the vaccine. After the second dose of the vaccine, both Pfizer and Moderna, it's more common to see people have a low-grade fever, chills, and body aches that last about 24 to 48 hours. That's not uncommon at all. We expect that. Why? Because we're stimulating the immune system, and when your immune system has a very robust response to something that's foreign, it's going to have that kind of a reaction. That's the way our immune systems work. So it's actually a good thing, believe it or not, when you see that happen, because we know that the vaccine's actually causing our immune system to do what we want it to do to protect us against the virus. So first of all, I just want to be clear that there are some adverse events that we actually expect to happen from the vaccine. There are some things also that can rarely occur with the vaccine. For example, anaphylaxis. Anaphylaxis is a severe allergic reaction that causes a person to stop breathing or that obstructs their airway. Anaphylaxis can occur with any vaccine. In fact, every vaccine that's known out there has some risk of anaphylaxis. As we've gained more experience with the COVID vaccines, we've learned that the risk of anaphylaxis with the COVID vaccines is about 4 in 1 million. So after of about every 1 million doses we give, 4 people will have anaphylaxis, will have a stop breathing or have an anaphylactic reaction. To this day, to my knowledge, there haven't been any cases of people who've died from that anaphylaxis, because medical management for anaphylaxis is pretty easy to follow up. And I mean, we got the right medicines, you've got medical personnel administering the vaccine, so that really helps us. I also want to address a couple of other specific questions related to adverse events and concerns about adverse events. There's some things that the vaccine is credited to cause that it doesn't cause or hasn't been proven to cause. For one thing, infertility. There's a lot of people who are concerned about the vaccine causing infertility. Frankly, public health authorities are not sure what the origins of this were. There is no scientific basis for it. The mRNA vaccines contain a messenger RNA that's coded to the S protein. And I know we have a lot of medical professionals on, so I'm balancing using some medical terminology with non-medical, but there's a specific protein, the spike protein on the coronavirus. And that messenger RNA spike protein is enveloped in lipids. To put it in an oversimplified term, it's like fats that are around the mRNA. And those are natural substances that actually we encounter in our daily lives all the time with the medicines we take and with the foods that we eat. So there's nothing really that's synthesized in that outer ring. And it delivers that messenger RNA in our bodies, and then it replicates to be able to produce the antibodies. Because there's nothing specific in the messenger RNA that impacts the placenta or impacts any part of the reproductive system, there's no protein marker that's aimed at human cells. It would be, it's almost unimaginable that you could have any adverse event that would impact fertility. There's just no cross measurement at all in the DNA or RNA sequences with the coronavirus in human tissue. So there's really no evidence of that. And the CDC has collected, and globally we've collected a great number of cases of pregnant women who have been vaccinated with the COVID vaccine. And what we've seen with those data is that there's no increased risk of miscarriage associated with receiving the vaccine. And that's not been observed at this point with about 50 million doses that have been given. And so, we believe, based upon the data we see now, that the vaccine appears to be tolerated well in pregnant women, and there should be no concern. I have two daughters. One is 18, and one is 21, 22, almost 22. My 22-year-old is in the health professions field, and so she's been vaccinated. My 18-year-old has also been vaccinated, and she and neither of them were concerned. We discussed it. They weren't concerned about it. They made educated decisions, and so they've been vaccinated. So I think you just, for what it's worth, I think those are some, and I'm happy to take other questions. I'm going to try to respond, Zane, to some of the clinical questions in the Q&A box as you guys continue having discussion about the religious and legal aspects, because I think Nick and Jennifer are much more well qualified to speak on those subjects. And I'll try to answer the clinical questions in the Q&A box in the meantime.
Thank you, Michael. And I would just echo what Michael just said. Just last night, I received my second dose, and I have a sore left arm a little bit. I have not taken Tylenol at all. I have a little bit of low-grade fever, but I'm here with you and enjoying this conversation and talking about these important issues. I want to, we've been talking about the efficacy, the safety, and also perhaps the individual and communal moral imperative associated with vaccination, not only with regard to COVID, but also just vaccination in general. And that has led to various legal mandates over the history of the United States and other countries to have different sorts of mandates that Jennifer and Nick talked about. And so that is a reality enforced through oftentimes schools, sometimes through employment, and also perhaps going forward, it remains to be seen how any kind of new mandate there might be. But that's really why we're here to kind of think about how we're going to be addressing the question of vaccination and mandating. And part of that mandate is exemptions that Jennifer talked about. There are medical exemptions, and historically there's been, depending on the jurisdiction, religious, philosophical, and other, sometimes perhaps cultural exemptions. But the trend, as Jennifer has talked about, has been toward narrowing of the exemptions because of the rise in those who are hesitant, those who are resistant, those who are more overtly objecting to both the science and the just idea of mandating something that is and feels to be very personal, and that is our personal health. So in light of that context, without further belaboring the reality, I want to bring our conversation to the hesitations that are the reality of our lives, the concerns, the resistance, and objections, and requests for new exemptions that are in conversation. And so let's first start. This is a religion and the law forum. So let's just start with some religious objections that have been placed. Let's consider them seriously and also think about together how those should be addressed, at least from the perspectives that are shared here. So I want to first go to Nick. What are some of the representative religious objections that you've seen to various mandates, and how, what are the merits, and what kind of weight are they given, and should they be given?
Well, it's a great question, and there really aren't any significant world religions that are objecting to the COVID-19 vaccine that I know of. Sometimes some other vaccines have had materials that either Orthodox Jews or Muslims or maybe Adventists consider to be unclean, using fetal tissue, but these vaccines don't have that. Probably the groups that might be vaccine objectors on religious grounds, Christian Scientists often don't engage in any kind of conventional medical treatment. Ironically, Mary Baker Eddy actually has a quote where she says, if vaccines are mandated, you should take them and then pray about the results and be protected through prayer. But that hasn't necessarily circulated in the larger community, apparently. So you do have some objectors there. You have some objectors in strict Amish and Mennonite communities, largely, again, not because of a particular doctrine, but a suspicion of science and a suspicion of technology, bringing in artificial outside means for healing. There are Adventists that will object, probably in terms of general, and I've seen something in the chat, Ellen White had a fair bit to say about the use and misuse of drugs in her day. And she was often opposed to the general and free use of drugs. She clearly was not against all drugs. And if you study her statements over time, it becomes clear. And I think even today, we're committed to not using drugs when we don't have to and minimizing the use of drugs and so on and so forth. She doesn't have anything herself written about vaccines, but her secretary does. And I think this is important for people to know. D.E. Robinson was a very faithful secretary of hers. And he wrote that when he was with her at a particular time in a vicinity where there was an epidemic of smallpox, that she herself, and she urged her workers to be vaccinated. And he says this: in taking this step, she recognized that it had been proven that vaccination either renders one immune from smallpox or greatly lessens its effects if one does come down with it. She also recognized the danger of their exposing others if they fail to take this precaution. So it's interesting that she saw this very much as a community protection a step in her own life. And so it's, of course, there are Adventists that will continue to oppose this on other philosophical and safety grounds, but it's hard to view that as a religiously based objection, at least when it comes to a formal doctrinal stands that the church might have. So that's a general overview of some of the objections in the larger religious and Christian community. There's one other I should add that's not necessarily religious, and I think this is one that I'm the most sympathetic to. The various minority communities, especially the African American community, have in the past been subject to involuntarily experimentation. The Tuskegee experiments are a famous and well-known example, and this community has a level of distrust, and fairly so, from their experiences in the past. And for that reason, the acceptance of vaccine in those communities is quite a bit lower. And of course, the paradoxical, sad irony is that these communities are actually being hit by the virus at higher levels of percentages because of access to healthcare resources, working in essential frontline jobs. And I feel that as Adventists and leaders and educators and whatever influence we have, that if we can persuade that maybe this it's still, as Dr. Hogue points out, it's under an emergency authorization, but we're not experimenting on people anymore, right? We're giving this to our leaders. We're not wanting to find minorities and experiment on them. And I just think we need to think of ways of religious leaders who care about these communities to communicate a level of confidence and education to help dissolve this fear.
Nick, I'm so glad you brought this up. I think it's a really, really important issue. It's come up on the chat. Alan asks, will you address the disparate treatment of minorities in vaccine distribution, as well as in mortality rates? I'd love to reflect on this a little bit more with other panelists, as well as kind of address this issue of how do we improve in this and build back trust, right? How do we distribute more equally? Michael, Jennifer, I don't know if you wanted to address this important question that Nick has brought up, as well as our...
Yeah, no, I think Nick raised a really important point, and that is within the African American community, because of the history. I mean, there was testing during slavery, being used as involuntary test subjects for medical treatments. The Tuskegee, that those experiments which were horrific, that planted the seeds of a lot of distrust. Even Henrietta Lacks and her cells being used without her knowledge. There's just this long-standing history. And I think one way to combat that is through education and transparency. I think that, the government has been really great so far in doing a lot of education for the public to let them know what the risks are, what the risks aren't. But that's just going to have to continue because of the longstanding history of the mistreatment of Black people within this country and other minorities as well.
We had some success recently at Loma Linda with a mobile vaccination clinic, and I think I'd like to talk about why it was successful. I think we had a great partnership that existed between the university and the predominantly Black churches in the San Bernardino area. And our champion healthcare professional that really works so closely with the churches is Dr. Jacinda Abdul Mutakibber, who is a pharmacist, African-American pharmacist. And she's an infectious disease specialist and an expert in vaccines and infectious disease topics. And she really spent some time trying to hear and listen carefully. And I think that's one of the things we forget sometimes to do is to listen. We have to listen to what people's concerns are, and we have to carefully consider those concerns and weigh those concerns and address them in a respectful way that helps people understand what is correct and what's incorrect. There's a lot of misinformation out there on the internet, and misinformation flies faster than correct information, I've learned over the years, and regardless of the community. But because we took time, we were able to immunize 450 people in the community through this mobile clinic as a partnership with the church. And it was a wonderful partnership. And I think what we've learned is that we've got to be more proactive at helping our communities and answering questions. It's just, I think in healthcare, this is one of the broken things. And one of the things that leads to mistrust in our healthcare system overall is that we think that if we offer something, people will just come. And that's just not right. That because there is so much systemic, has been in our healthcare system nationwide, so much systemic racism and mistrust that's existed across the nation, really, in our entire healthcare system. We can't expect that just because we offer something, people are going to come running to it. We have to take time to engage fully in our communities, and especially engage fully in our communities of color. And we have to listen, and we have to work carefully to try to address those concerns. And I think we have a moral obligation to do that. I really do, as healthcare professionals. And I'm very excited to see my colleagues at Loma Linda working so diligently to try to make those outreaches. And I pray that across the country, all of our health systems will do this, and that healthcare professionals will engage. And if you're not a healthcare professional and you're listening to this program, maybe you're a pastor, an elder in your church, and reach out to your local healthcare systems and offer to be a conduit to help get information into the community. That's so important. Don't wait on the health system to come. Go to them and engage them and seek out their help, because I think that's will be very good approach to move forward.
Michael just talked about a very helpful point about respectful engagement. But at some point, a respectful engagement and conversation breaks down because we're at a standstill or there is an impasse. And that often seems to be happening more these days, leading to some sort of a legal or political decision that appears to be required at times. And so I want to return to Nick, kind of framing this in the legal context. What are the, if you can just briefly summarize the points of the conversation, focusing on maybe the libertarian argument and certain religious arguments, like individuals who feel that, yes, I want to be listened to, but I also want to be allowed to do what I believe is the right thing for me, and as opposed to the majority interest that we've been talking about. So could you kind of talk about the conversation between legal interest here?
Sure. So let's just do a brief primer on basic constitutional rights and what you have to do to make somebody do something against their right, right? So no constitutional right is absolute. You can't shout fire in a crowded theater. You can't carry out human sacrifices on behalf of religion, right? Everything is limited in some way. Rights are a balancing of values and individual values and community values. And the way it operates is two steps: to invade some fundamental right, which we agree that vaccine objection is. It's that an objection is based on personal autonomy. It's based on religious objection, even if it's not held by a larger community. So we're not saying there's no legitimate right or objection. The question is, at what point can the government limit that objection or limit that right? And there's a two-step test. One is that the government has to be advancing some compelling interest that's fundamental to the existence of the state. And the life and health of others is generally considered to be a compelling interest. Basically, if the government doesn't keep people alive, there's nothing to govern. But the second part of the test is the more important part, because the government can justify lots of things in the name of safety and security. But the second part is it has to frame that intrusion into your life in the narrowly tailored means that it can advance the interest that's legitimate, but do so in a way that infringes as little as possible on your autonomy or your freedom. And so I think in the case of vaccines, we're coming back to what I've already said, that I think it's very unlikely that the Supreme Court would uphold just a blanket requirement of everybody being vaccinated, right? That would be a very broad requirement. That it wouldn't be least intrusive. Certainly there should be medical exemptions for people who are going to die or have severe problems from taking the vaccine. But even for others, I think that the state will have to figure out ways to meet their health interests and still respect the conscience or the autonomy or the religious beliefs of the individual. But it can involve, I can't speak for Andrews University, I'm not in charge here and I'm not speaking on their behalf, but I can tell you that at each stage of the technology involving this, whether it be testing or monitoring, they're requiring it, right? If I don't hit that little symptom update every day and I fall behind a certain percentage, I'm not welcome on campus. If I don't take my test at the beginning of the semester, I'm not welcome on campus. Well, I envision probably in the next year that if I don't take my vaccine, I will probably not be welcome on campus. And honestly, as a professor, I'm okay with that because I want especially my older colleagues to stay alive. That's the first and most fundamental thing we can do is to keep each other alive. Now, I hope that my university, talking about least intrusive means, that we will continue offering Zoom classes online, and people that either medically or maybe have some strong conscience objection to it, I'm hoping and believing that we will work with them to provide them education off-site. And I think the government, under the constitutional standard, like, we're not bound by the Constitution. We could require everybody to get the vaccine probably, and there wouldn't be a constitutional objection. But for the government, for public universities and public places, I think, again, the government needs to find ways to allow people to work from a distance, to study from a distance, to put public funds into picking up and dropping off groceries and that kind of thing, so that you don't just cut people off from society in toto, but you use this least restrictive means analysis that while we're going to be restricting their freedoms and liberties to some extent, but that's the cost of, you don't have a right to threaten other people with a communicable disease that you may have and you're not willing to treat. We're going to respect your right, but we're going to have to limit you in certain ways. But we're hoping that this balancing will be fair and not a kind of social death. So that's sort of an overview of it anyway.
Thank you. That's an excellent constitutional framing that I think we should all be aware of is what you began with. That is that none of our rights are infallible and absolute, and it's a relationship or interplay of rights that we're really struggling with. Michael, I wanted to. There's a question, or there's a comment that Nick made earlier with regard to the religious objections and how the vaccines were processed. And with regard to COVID vaccine, there doesn't appear to be have the same concerns that, say, Roman Catholics might have had for other vaccines. So if you could sort of speak to the COVID vaccine in particular as to any concerns there might be for example, a devout Roman Catholic or perhaps a Seventh-day Adventist even, and then broaden that to kind of how the different vaccines are processed that would address some of these religious concerns.
Yeah, that's a great question, and we get this question a lot. The question is aborted fetal material used in the production of the COVID vaccines? The simple answer to the question is no, there's no aborted fetal material used in the mass production of these vaccines. What you should know is that back in the late 1970s, there was an aborted fetus in Europe whose stem cells were used for scientific discovery. And those stem cells have been used for discovery for lots of purposes over the years. And of course, and speaking specifically to the position of the Catholic Church, because they've probably been the most vocal globally about this issue, the Catholic Church's position would be that there's nothing that would be acceptable that utilizes or condones the abortion that took place, and so that would be a pretty strong position of the Catholic Church, and they've written extensively about this subject. So and I wish I had the link to post for you here, but there's pretty extensive writing from especially the U.S. bishops on this topic. But for the mRNA vaccines, the cell line that's used was first identified in the 1970s. The technology was first identified back at that time, but there's no direct connection in terms of the use of that for the production of the mRNA vaccine. So there needs not be any concern there. And even the Catholic Church has very publicly stated that it is completely acceptable for Roman Catholics to receive the mRNA vaccine to try to prevent the pandemic. There is a little bit more direct connection to the adenovirus vaccine, the Janssen J&J vaccine, to the fetal cell line, because the production process for the vaccine does include replicating an adenovirus that came from these stem cell lines. However, there's no fetal material that's used, and there have been no other abortions or aborted fetuses that have been used to produce the vaccine. The Catholic Church advises their members that if a choice is available, the Catholic Church's preference would be for their members to receive the mRNA vaccine over the adenovirus vaccine. However, they're very, very clearly say that that it is acceptable and permissible to receive the adenovirus vector vaccine because of the serious adverse outcomes, death that can occur from coronavirus. And so they have said, the Catholic Church has said that it is okay to use the vaccines because it promotes the public health and the greater good. So I point that out. I think that's what you were getting at, Julius, in terms of that link. There are no preservatives in the vaccines. I want to just say that very clearly. I also want to say Despite lots of websites that claim otherwise, there are no microchips or trackers in the vaccine. Nobody can track you, or nobody can encode your DNA from this. These vaccines do not have the ability to change human DNA. They can't enter the nucleus and change your DNA. Even though the adenovirus vector does go into the cell nucleus and uses your cell mechanism to be able to replicate the antigen, the messenger RNA that prevents coronavirus, it does not change your DNA because there's no genetic, there has to be a special genetic enzyme for that to happen, and it doesn't exist in this vaccine. So I just would point out those things are also common things that are out there about the ingredients and so forth. So that hopefully that will help with many people's concerns about the vaccine. And the last thing I want to mention is several people have called this an experimental vaccine. It's not experimental. I want to be very clear about that. The vaccine continues to be studied and we continue to learn, but it is not experimental. We've given this vaccine, these two vaccines have been administered to 50 million people already. 50 million people, that's a lot of people. That's not experimental. We've got a lot of data. We have the data from the people who've received the vaccines. And there are studies that are ongoing, but stop and think about it for just a minute. We continue to study things that we've been using in medicine for decades and decades and decades. We continue to study things all the time. That doesn't make them experimental. It just means that our curiosities and our responsibility are to continue to monitor how the products that we use in our daily lives are working in our bodies, and we learn more and more about them all the time. So even the old antibiotic sulfa drugs that were developed in the 1930s, we continue to study sulfa drugs. That doesn't make sulfa drugs experimental. Same thing's true for the vaccines here. They're not experimental vaccines. They're vaccines that we continue to study to examine how they work in our bodies and the outcomes that are going to come from them. And hopefully that will help put it in perspective just a bit.
I want to go to Zane first and then go to Jennifer. Zane, you and I this morning spent a couple hours talking about what we will be talking about, what we're not talking about. And one of the things that you touched on earlier that I want to ask you to expand upon is the creation theology and the command for stewardship as it relates to this issue.
Sure. Yeah, I think that we could look at the Old Testament, what Christians call the Old Testament, part of the Bible we share with actually the Jewish community, and some of the instructions we get there in the very beginning, in the creation story. Humans are placed in a garden, and they're basically given the role of being caretakers of that garden, right? And then all the inhabitants of the garden, that include the animals as well as the garden itself and people, right? And so I love this idea that we get that we are called to care for the garden, to care for each other. That's really a fundamental to our created identities as human beings. And I think another relevant teaching would be if we look in the Hebraic tradition, the prophets remind us that God wants us to care for the most vulnerable in society. Right? That it's not just our interests that that should be at the forefront, but what have you done for the poor, the widow, right? The foreigner, the orphan. Okay, and I think that should inform, I hope, our reasoning about the vaccines if we're coming from either of those, either Christian or Jewish traditions.
Yeah, what I find also meaningful for me in thinking about this issue is Jesus' Sabbath teaching with regard to an ox or a donkey fallen into a ditch on a Sabbath. What should an observant Sabbath keeper do when confronted with the prospect of working to save the animal? And the answer is yes, you should work so that you can get the animal out to safety. And so there are these competing interests, principles at work, and yet the principle that Jesus teaches is overwhelmingly in favor of saving life. And for me, that's a kind of important principle to keep in mind, even when we feel that our individual rights or preferences or convictions are being, quote, violated. That one way to think about would be to really think about how that leads to a greater satisfaction of God's command, which is to for abundant life and to love. Jennifer, if you've studied public health, you've practiced healthcare law, and now you're working for the Adventist Church headquarters in other areas. What strategies in terms of how we might implement some of these ideas? We've dealt with so many different ideas, so you might be asking which idea, Julius. But in terms of how we put into practice these biblical principles and the scientific knowledge that we're learning into our communities, especially the communities that are often left behind.
Sure. Well, I think that one strategy that the General Conference has taken is that our Health Ministries Department, they recently issued a series of frequently asked questions, and I think it's just education, right? So if you go on to the General Conference's website and you put in, COVID-19 questions and answers, there's transparency there. They talk about a lot of the things that we talked about right now. I think that, it does boil down to the individual's decision, at least at this time, whether or not to get vaccinated. And as Nick said, there may be some restrictions if you choose not to be vaccinated, but it is the individual's choice. But as a church, our view on vaccination and immunization is very clear. And we believe in medical science, and we believe in reasonable vaccination. And I think that our church just has to continue to state that message.
Well, our time is drawing to a close soon. We have about 5 minutes that within the time that we've planned for. I think Nick has a closing comment, and then I'll turn it back to Zane for his closing comments, unless Michael and Jennifer want to share something quickly as we close. But Nick?
Yeah, so I just wanted to step in on the biblical thought here. I do think that there are something from the New Testament and the Old Testament. I'll start with the Old Testament. Some people are concerned about, well, can we require a community to take such an invasive practice on behalf of the larger community? And I have to ask this question, especially to the gentlemen out there. What do you view as more invasive, getting an injection or being circumcised? It's interesting that God put down for the whole Jewish community a sign of identity that was quite physically invasive. And I'm sure it had spiritual meanings to it. But I think it also was a health issue in the desert, in a place where cleanliness was difficult. It helped cut down on infections and keep the community a safer place. And I think that it's not a huge leap to suggest that as a community we accept something that makes us a healthier place. And then I think of the miracle of Christ. Some people object to bringing artificial objects from outside their bodies for health and for curing something. But Christ could have healed everybody just by talking. He sometimes did it from a distance, but occasionally he healed. And I think there was a purpose, a lesson in his healing. And the one I'm thinking of most directly is found in the book of John, and John 9, verses 6 and 7, where he heals a blind man. And you'll remember the story. It's actually a 3-step process. He takes some mud, he spits on it, he anoints the man's eyes, and then he sends him to wash in the pool of Siloam. And for me, as looking at this symbolically, right, talk about foreign substances. It's an organic and inorganic combination that is put together and then inserted into this man's eyes, and then he himself is involved in washing it off. And I think that there's a message there of some kind, that in cooperating with God's healing processes, that he at times will use organic and inorganic matter and have a human element involved with it. And that the theology of this, of the theology of the vaccine, has its roots in the teachings and actions of Christ himself. So I think there's some good theology to be drawn from those lessons.
Zane, back to you.
Nick, we're just wrapping it up and you want to start doing some theology. Just want to thank our panelists, Michael, Jennifer, Nick, for joining us and spending some time a Sabbath afternoon for many people discussing these matters. I want to thank you for doing the same as those of you who are joining the webinar. We hope that the conversation will continue and that there will be more thoughtful reflection and prayer on the issues that we've tried to address here today. Try to clarify the competing interests sometimes that take place between individual rights and concerns one has with the public good. We've tried to address some of those concerns and acknowledge some of the risk, all the while clarifying that these vaccines, as they're rolling out, seem to be having dramatic impact in dropping the rates of death and infection in the communities where people have been vaccinated with minimal relative side effects, right? So consider those things. And we've talked also about the Bible. We've referenced the prophets, the Torah. We referenced Jesus just now. So let me just close by referencing a text from the Apostle Paul. I hope you can continue thinking about as you reflect on these things. And this is from the book of Galatians, chapter 5:14. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. So it's my prayer that today, as we wrap things up, that we will seek to be better neighbors, that we will seek to fulfill the law. So thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, great evening, and we hope you'll join us next time.